Long ago, most of these species had given up cooking. Food had become a matter of science, not joy. Nutrient paste was cheap, easy to make, and kept everyone alive. Over generations, the old habits of taste, smell, and flavor had faded away, replaced by pure efficiency. Nobody on the station even remembered why food had once mattered so much. Humanity was the newest member of the Alliance, having joined only 3 years earlier. Most other species still viewed humans as simple and a little strange. Humans laughed too loudly, moved too fast, and worst of all, still clung to the odd habit of cooking. To the older species, this seemed almost embarrassing, like a child who refused to grow out of a silly game. Daniel Ortiz was one of the few thousand humans living aboard Corn Hub. Before joining the Alliance program, he had spent nearly 10 years working in restaurant kitchens back on Earth. He knew the sound of a knife on a wooden board, the smell of onions turning soft in a hot pan, and the quiet pride of watching someone enjoy a meal he had made. But none of that mattered here. On the station, his job was logistics, tracking supply crates, and filing reports about storage units. His hands, once quick and sure with a blade, now spent their days typing numbers into a screen. Captain Reyes led the small human delegation on the station. She was a steady, practical woman who understood that humanity's place in the Alliance was still fragile. Every mistake, every awkward moment, could be used by other species to question whether humans truly belonged among them. She often reminded her team to stay professional, to avoid drawing attention, and to prove their worth through hard work rather than argument. Not every alien species looked down on humans. Overseer Threll, the calm and fair administrator who managed the daily running of Corn Hub, treated all species equally, at least in public. Threll had seen many new species join the Alliance over the decades and had learned that first impressions rarely told the whole story. Threll paid little attention to gossip and focused instead on keeping the station running smoothly. The Vosh, however, were a different matter. Proud, disciplined, and fiercely traditional, the Vosh saw themselves as the natural leaders of the Alliance. Their warriors had fought in more conflicts than any other species present, and their officers carried themselves with a certain stiff confidence that left little room for humility. Commander Doran, a senior Vosh officer stationed aboard Corn Hub, was known for his sharp tongue and his low opinion of newer species. He believed humanity's obsession with food was proof of their weakness, a sign that they had not yet learned to rise above simple animal instinct. Doran often made comments about this at official gatherings, usually with a thin smile that suggested he found the whole subject amusing rather than serious. Most humans chose to ignore him, including Daniel, who had learned that arguing with a Vosh officer rarely ended well. Life on Corn Hub moved forward in its usual quiet rhythm. Shifts began and ended. Reports were filed. Paste was distributed and consumed without much thought. Yet beneath this routine, small tensions were building. Newer species like humanity were beginning to ask why life aboard the station had to be so plain, so joyless. A few young Vosh officers, though careful not to say it in front of their commanders, had grown curious about the human habit of cooking, wondering what it might actually be like to taste something instead of simply consuming it. None of this was obvious yet. On the surface, everything appeared calm and orderly, just another day on a station built for efficiency rather than pleasure. But somewhere in the quiet hum of the nutrient dispensers, and in the small data file of old recipes that Daniel kept hidden away, the first threads of something unexpected were already beginning to form. Nobody knew it yet, but a simple dare, born out of pride and mockery, was about to change the way an entire station thought about food, about humanity, and about what it truly meant to enjoy a meal together. Daniel had no idea, as he closed his shift report that evening, that his quiet life behind a supply desk was about to end, and that the skills he thought he had left behind on Earth were about to become the most important thing he had ever done. Laughter did not belong in the grand hall of Corn Hub, yet on the night of the formal Alliance dinner, a strange kind of laughter filled the air anyway, sharp and mocking rather than warm. Delegates from a dozen species sat around a long curved table, cups of nutrient paste placed neatly in front of each seat, while conversations about trade routes and border disputes drifted lazily between courses that were not really courses at all, just the same gray paste served in slightly fancier containers. These formal dinners happened once a month, a tradition meant to keep relations smooth between the many species of the Alliance. Nobody expected much excitement from them. They were long, polite, and mostly forgettable. Tonight, however, would be different, though nobody at the table realized it yet. Commander Doran sat near the head of the table, dressed in the sharp gray uniform of the Vosh military, his posture straight and proud as always. Beside him sat Yulin, a younger Vosh science officer with a curious mind and a habit of asking questions that made older officers uncomfortable. Captain Reyes sat further down the table with a small group of human delegates, including Daniel, who had been asked to attend simply to help manage supply reports for the evening rather than take part in any real conversation. The trouble began, as it often did, with a small comment. Doran had been listening to a nearby delegate mention that the humans still practice something called cooking, preparing meals by hand instead of relying on standard nutrient production. Doran let out a short, dry laugh. Cooking, he repeated, saying the word slowly, as if testing how strange it sounded. A charming little ritual. Humans mixing substances together by hand, hoping something edible comes out of it. It explains a great deal about their species. A few polite chuckles followed from nearby officers, eager to agree with the commander rather than risk his displeasure. Captain Reyes kept her expression calm, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had heard comments like this before and knew the best response was usually silence. But Yulin, curious as always, leaned forward. Is it true that the taste changes depending on how it is prepared? Our historical records mention something called flavor, though the concept was lost generations ago. Doran waved a hand dismissively. A primitive concept. Nothing more than chemical reactions convincing weak minds that one meal is better than another. It is inefficient, wasteful, a distraction from real progress. Reyes finally spoke, her voice steady. It is part of our culture, Commander, just as your training rituals are part of yours. Doran's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a challenge in her tone, though her words remained polite. He turned his gaze toward Daniel, who had been quietly reviewing supply notes on a small screen, trying to avoid attention. You, Doran said, his voice carrying across that section of the table. I am told you humans still practice this old craft personally, not simply through machines. Is that correct? Daniel looked up, startled to suddenly be part of the conversation. Some of us do, yes. Then prove it, Doran said, a thin smile forming on his face. If this cooking is truly worth the effort humans claim it to be, prepare a meal for this table. For all of us. Let us see if it is anything more than a curious habit clung to by a species too stubborn to modernize. The hall grew quiet. Several delegates from other species turned their attention toward the human section of the table, sensing the sudden shift in mood. Reyes felt a flicker of concern. A public dare like this, especially one issued so directly, could not simply be brushed aside without appearing weak. And appearing weak was something the human delegation could not afford this early in their membership. Daniel felt every eye on him, his heart beating a little faster. He glanced at Reyes, unsure whether to accept or decline. Refusing might make humanity look afraid or ashamed of their own customs. Accepting meant standing in front of dozens of skeptical aliens with almost no proper kitchen, no familiar ingredients, and very little time to prepare. Reyes met his eyes briefly, giving the smallest nod, a silent signal that the choice, though difficult, was his to make. Daniel took a slow breath. I accept, he said, his voice steadier than he expected. Give me 3 days. Doran's smile widened, clearly pleased, believing this would end in an easy, entertaining failure. 3 days, then. I look forward to it. Murmurs spread across the hall as the dinner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the mood had shifted. Word of the dare would spread quickly across the station, carried through private conversations and quiet messages between crew members. By morning, nearly everyone would know that a human logistics officer had accepted a challenge from a Vosh commander, a challenge that many expected to end in humiliation. As the dinner ended and delegates began to leave, Yulin lingered for a moment near Daniel, studying him with quiet curiosity rather than mockery. I hope it goes well for you, Yulin said simply, before turning to follow the other officers out of the hall. Daniel sat alone for a moment after most of the guests had gone, staring at the half-empty cup of paste in front of him, suddenly aware of just how much he had agreed to. 3 days to prove that cooking, something the rest of the galaxy had long forgotten, was still worth caring about. 3 days to turn an old family recipe file and a handful of borrowed ingredients into something that could silence a room full of doubters. He had no real kitchen, no proper tools, no guarantee that alien taste buds would respond to human food the way human ones did. All he had was memory, a bit of skill, and a growing determination not to let Doran's mocking smile be the last word on the subject. A storage room on level 9 was never meant to become a kitchen, yet by the second hour of searching, Daniel had already decided it would have to do. The room was small, lined with metal shelves, and smelled faintly of machine oil rather than anything close to food. Still, it had a power outlet, a flat steel table, and enough space to move around without knocking into the walls. For someone with 3 days and almost nothing else, it felt like a small miracle. The first problem was tools. Corn Hub had no kitchens, no ovens, no knives meant for cutting food rather than cutting cargo straps. Daniel spent the first several hours going through old supply records, searching for anything that might work. He found a heating unit meant for warming machine parts, which, after some careful testing, could double as a stovetop if watched closely. A thin metal cutting tool from the engineering department became his knife once he sharpened one edge against a polishing wheel. It was not perfect, but it would cut. The second problem, far bigger than the first, was ingredients. The station's hydroponics bay grew only a narrow list of approved nutrient crops, plants engineered for efficiency rather than taste. Rows of pale green stalks and flavorless roots stretched across the growing floor, none of them familiar to Daniel, none of them anything close to what he needed. He walked the hydroponics bay slowly that first evening, running his fingers over unfamiliar leaves, tasting small pieces cautiously, spitting most of them back out. Many were bland. A few were bitter enough to make his eyes water. But here and there, hidden among rows nobody paid attention to, he found small surprises. A red root with a slightly sweet, earthy taste, similar to a carrot. A leafy plant with a sharp, peppery bite, not unlike arugula. A thick-stemmed vegetable that, once heated, released a smell close to roasted garlic. Word of Daniel's task had already spread across the station, and a handful of fellow humans, curious and eager to help, began showing up outside the storage room without being asked. Among them were 2 former line cooks, a retired baker, and a young engineer who simply wanted to be part of something exciting for once. Nobody had assigned them to help. They came because, like Daniel, they missed the smell of real food, and the idea of proving something to the rest of the Alliance quietly excited them. Together, the small group worked through the first night, testing combinations, arguing gently over which ingredients worked best, and slowly turning the plain storage room into something that almost resembled a working kitchen. Someone rigged a better ventilation system to pull smoke and steam away from the room. Someone else found a way to keep certain ingredients cold using a repurposed cooling unit from the cargo bay. Daniel focused on flavor first, testing small batches on scraps of nutrient dough, trying to build something that felt familiar without relying on ingredients Earth once had, but Corn Hub did not. He had no beef, no wheat, no butter, no proper spices. What he had instead was patience, memory, and a willingness to fail quietly, again and again, until something worked. By the second day, a rough plan had formed. He would prepare a simple, comforting dish, something close to a warm vegetable stew paired with a flat, pan-cooked bread made from a starchy hydroponics crop that, when ground and mixed with water, behaved surprisingly close to flour. It was humble. It was not fancy, but it was honest food, made with care, and Daniel believed that honesty mattered more than complexity when trying to reach people who had never truly tasted anything before. Not everyone believed the plan would work. A few humans quietly worried that alien biology might reject human-style cooking entirely, that unfamiliar textures or smells could cause more confusion than appreciation. Others worried that even if the food tasted good to humans, alien senses long dulled by nutrient paste might not respond the same way. Daniel worried about these things too, late at night, staring at his small collection of borrowed pots and untested vegetables. But every time doubt crept in, he thought back to his grandmother's kitchen, the warm smell of bread rising, the sound of a spoon scraping the bottom of a pot, and the simple joy on someone's face after the first bite of a meal made with real care. That feeling, he believed, was something every living being could understand, no matter what world they came from. On the third and final day, the group gathered early, running through the recipe one last time, checking every step, tasting every batch. The storage room, once cold and empty, now carried a warm, rich smell that drifted faintly into the corridor outside, catching the attention of a few passing crew members who paused, confused, unsure why the air suddenly smelled different than it ever had before. Daniel stood at the center of it all, sleeves rolled up, hands slightly burned from the makeshift heating unit, staring at a simple pot of stew and a stack of warm flatbread. It was not fancy, it was not perfect, but it was real food, made with real effort, ready to be placed in front of a room full of skeptical aliens who had long forgotten what food could truly be. As the final hour approached, Daniel took a slow breath, wiped his hands, and looked at the small group of humans who had helped him without being asked. Whatever happened next, he was no longer facing this dare alone. Steam rose gently from a covered pot as it was wheeled through the corridors of Corin Hub, and for the first time in living memory, several crew members stopped mid-step, turning their heads toward a smell they could not immediately explain. It was warm, rich, and slightly sweet, drifting through the recycled air like something out of an old story rather than something happening in real life. Nobody said anything out loud, but more than a few pairs of eyes followed the pot's slow journey toward the main dining hall. The hall itself had been arranged much like it was for any formal alliance dinner: long curved tables, neat rows of seating, and soft overhead lighting. The only real difference was the low table set near the center, where Daniel and his small group of helpers began carefully arranging the meal they had spent 3 days preparing. Bowls of warm vegetable stew were placed beside stacks of flat, golden bread, still slightly steaming from the makeshift heating unit. Delegates began arriving in small groups, many of them curious rather than serious, treating the event as little more than an amusing sideshow before returning to their usual routines. Commander Doran arrived early, standing near the front with his arms crossed, a confident half-smile already fixed on his face. He fully expected to watch a short, awkward failure, something he could later reference whenever humanity's habits came up in conversation. Yulin arrived shortly after, taking a seat near the front rather than standing back with the other officers. Unlike Doran, there was no smugness in her expression, only quiet curiosity, the same look she had worn during the dinner 3 nights earlier when she first asked about the meaning of flavor. Captain Reyes stood near the human delegation, doing her best to appear calm, though her hands were tightly clasped behind her back. She had seen Daniel work tirelessly for 3 days and believed in his effort, but she also understood how much was riding on this single moment. A failure here would not simply embarrass one man. It would confirm every quiet insult the Vosh and others had ever made about humanity's habits. Overseer Threll entered last, taking a neutral position near the side of the hall, observing quietly as always, offering no opinion either way. Once the hall had settled, Daniel stepped forward, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes on him. He kept his explanation simple, describing the dish as a basic vegetable stew paired with flatbread, made using ingredients gathered from the station's own hydroponics bay. He did not promise anything grand. He simply invited everyone to try it. Bowls were passed around slowly, cautiously, many delegates sniffing the steam rising from their portion with visible uncertainty. A few Vosh officers exchanged quiet glances, clearly unsure whether this was something worth taking seriously. Doran picked up a small spoonful with an exaggerated air of patience, as if humoring a child. The first sound to break the tense silence was small, almost accidental. Yulin, who had taken her first bite a moment before the others, let out a soft, surprised breath, her eyes widening slightly. She lowered her spoon slowly, staring at the bowl in front of her as though seeing it for the first time. "This is," she began, pausing, searching for the right word. "There are layers to this. The taste changes as it settles. I did not expect that." A few nearby delegates, curious at her reaction, tried their own spoonfuls. One by one, similar expressions appeared around the table, confusion slowly turning into something closer to wonder. A soft murmur spread through the hall, quiet at first, then growing steadily louder as more delegates tasted the warm stew and torn pieces of fresh bread. Doran, still holding his spoon, finally took a proper bite, expecting little. His expression shifted almost immediately, though he tried to hide it behind a stiff, controlled face. The rich warmth of the stew, the soft texture of the bread, the layered taste that built with every bite, none of it matched what he had imagined. For a brief moment, his usual confidence faltered, replaced by something closer to genuine surprise. He set his spoon down carefully, clearing his throat as though preparing an official statement rather than admitting anything personal. "It is more complex than expected," he said finally, his voice noticeably less mocking than before. Around the table, the reaction grew stronger. Delegates who had barely touched their first bite were now reaching for seconds, some pausing mid-conversation just to focus on the taste in front of them. A few officers who rarely showed emotion in public sat quietly, eyes half closed, clearly savoring each bite rather than simply consuming it out of necessity. Reyes allowed herself a small, relieved smile as she watched the room shift from skepticism to quiet amazement. Daniel stood near the serving table, hands still slightly trembling from nerves, watching as bowl after bowl was emptied and refilled. It was not loud celebration. It was something quieter, more sincere, the simple sight of dozens of beings from different worlds experiencing real flavor, real texture, real food, many of them for the first time in their lives. Yulin looked up at him from across the table, a genuine smile forming on her face. "You have given us something we did not know we were missing," she said simply. Daniel did not have a grand response ready. He simply nodded, feeling something settle quietly in his chest, a mixture of relief, pride, and disbelief that a dare meant to embarrass him had instead brought an entire room of skeptical aliens together over a simple pot of stew and warm bread. As the meal continued and the hall filled with soft conversation rather than polite silence, nobody yet realized just how quickly this quiet dinner would turn into something the entire station would soon be talking about. By the third morning after the dinner, a line had formed outside the small storage room on level 9, long before Daniel had even arrived to begin his shift. It stretched down the corridor, curving past a supply closet and around a maintenance junction, filled with delegates, officers, and station workers from species that had barely spoken to each other in years, all standing together for the same simple reason. They wanted more food. News of the dinner had spread faster than anyone expected. What began as a quiet meal meant to settle a dare had turned into the main topic of conversation across nearly every level of Corn Hub. Private messages, station gossip, and casual conversations in hallways had carried the story from one department to another, growing slightly larger with each retelling. By the time Daniel returned to his makeshift kitchen the next day, he was no longer just a logistics officer who had won a small challenge. He had become, almost overnight, the most requested person on the entire station. At first, he tried to keep things simple, preparing small batches of the same stew and bread that had worked so well during the dinner. But demand grew far faster than his tiny kitchen could handle. Delegates who had never shown interest in anything outside official business began sending personal requests, some polite, some surprisingly forceful, all asking for a taste of what they now called real food. Overseer Threll, sensing the situation could quickly spiral out of control, stepped in personally to help organize things. A larger room on level 7, once used for storage, was quickly converted into a proper kitchen space, equipped with borrowed tools from engineering and cooling units repurposed from cargo storage. Threll also arranged a simple scheduling system, assigning specific time slots to different departments to prevent the growing crowds from turning into chaos. Even with these changes, tension quickly followed excitement. Species that rarely interacted began competing for attention, each believing their own needs were more important than the others. A minor dispute broke out between two delegations arguing over whose turn it was to be served first, forcing Threll to step in personally to calm things down. Elsewhere, a group of engineers jokingly threatened to reroute power away from another department's living quarters unless their request for a second serving was approved sooner. Through it all, Daniel found himself constantly busy, moving from one task to another, testing new ingredient combinations as different species began requesting variations suited to their own biology. Some needed milder flavors. Others, surprisingly, wanted things spicier than anything Daniel had originally planned. The retired baker who had helped him during the first 3 days now worked full-time developing new bread styles, while the two former line cooks took turns managing the growing kitchen alongside him. Commander Doran, still adjusting to his own change of heart, found himself in an especially awkward position. As word spread that he had personally issued the dare that started everything, other Vosh officers began quietly approaching him, asking if he could arrange a taste of the food himself, some out of genuine curiosity, others simply because everyone else seemed to be talking about it. Doran, who had spent years positioning himself as a proud, traditional officer above such indulgences, now found his own reputation tied to something he had once mocked. During one particularly busy afternoon, Doran arrived at the kitchen entrance personally, standing stiffly near the doorway rather than joining the line like everyone else. Daniel, catching sight of him between tasks, paused for a moment, unsure what to expect. "I did not come to repeat my earlier comments," Doran said, his tone unusually careful. "I came to request a proper serving. For myself, not as part of any official gathering." Daniel allowed himself a small, tired smile. "I can do that." Doran said nothing else as he waited, watching quietly as Daniel prepared a fresh bowl of stew alongside warm bread. When the bowl was finally placed in his hands, he studied it for a long moment before taking a slow, deliberate bite, clearly trying to maintain his usual composure. It did not last long. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time since the dare began, his expression softened into something closer to genuine enjoyment rather than forced tolerance. "You may serve me again tomorrow," he said simply, before turning and walking away, leaving Daniel standing there, quietly amused by how far things had come in such a short time. By the end of the week, the small kitchen on Level 7 had become one of the busiest places on the entire station, rivaling even the main trading hub in terms of daily visitors. What had started as a single dare, meant to embarrass a lone human officer, had instead pulled together dozens of species around something they had never truly experienced before: real flavor, real effort, and the simple pleasure of sharing a meal. Daniel barely had time to process how much his life had changed. Between managing requests, training new helpers, and constantly experimenting with unfamiliar ingredients, he rarely had a quiet moment to himself. Yet whenever he did pause, even briefly, he felt something he had not felt in years, a quiet sense of purpose, the same feeling he used to have back on Earth, standing in a hot kitchen, watching people enjoy something he had made with his own hands. Nobody on the station could have predicted that a single dare, born out of pride and mockery, would end up reshaping daily life aboard Corn Hub so quickly. Yet as more species lined up outside a small converted storage room, drawn by nothing more than the simple promise of a good meal, it was clear that something bigger than food had begun to take shape. A month earlier, nobody aboard Corn Hub would have believed that a simple kitchen could change the way an entire station thought about itself. Yet here it was, quietly proving otherwise, one shared meal at a time. What had begun as a small storage room on Level 9 had grown into a proper dining hall on Level 7, complete with long tables, working stoves built by the station's own engineers, and a steady rotation of dishes created by Daniel and the small team who had stood by him from the very beginning. Overseer Threll called a private meeting one quiet afternoon, inviting Daniel, Captain Reyes, and a few senior officials from different species to discuss what had happened over the past several weeks. The meeting room, usually reserved for trade disputes and border discussions, felt strangely different this time, calmer, almost relaxed, as though the tension that normally filled such rooms had softened along with everything else on the station. Threll began by laying out a simple observation. In the years since the Alliance had formed, few things had brought so many different species together so quickly, without argument, without formal negotiation, without pressure from any single government. Food, something once dismissed as outdated and unnecessary, had somehow succeeded where countless diplomatic meetings had failed. Species that rarely spoke outside official business now sat together at shared tables, exchanging stories, opinions, and simple conversation over meals that meant something far beyond basic nutrition. Captain Reyes spoke next, careful but clearly proud, explaining how humanity's place within the Alliance had shifted noticeably since the dinner. Delegates who once viewed humans as primitive newcomers now approached human crew members with genuine curiosity rather than quiet dismissal. Even routine meetings between departments had grown slightly warmer, filled with lighter conversation rather than strict formality. Threll turned to Daniel, asking a simple but important question. Would he be willing to take on a new, official role, overseeing food and hospitality efforts across the entire station, rather than continuing his previous work in supply logistics? It was not a small request. It meant leaving behind the quiet, predictable job he had held for years and stepping fully into something far more visible, far more demanding, and far more important than he had ever imagined for himself. Daniel did not answer immediately. He thought back to his early days on the station, filing reports behind a desk, quietly missing the sound of a busy kitchen, believing that part of his life was simply over. He thought about the exhausting first 3 days spent scrambling for ingredients, the nervous tension before that first dinner, and the quiet satisfaction of watching skeptical aliens slowly change their minds one bite at a time. "I accept," he said finally, the same steady words he had once used to accept Doran's dare, though this time spoken without hesitation or fear. Word of his new role spread quickly, though this time without mockery or doubt. Departments across the station began requesting his help setting up smaller kitchens of their own, eager to bring a taste of real food closer to their daily routines rather than relying solely on the central dining hall. Yulin, now spending much of her free time studying the science behind flavor and taste, began working closely with Daniel, documenting how different species responded to different ingredients, slowly building the Alliance's first proper understanding of culinary science in generations. Even Commander Doran, though still formal and reserved in most matters, had become something of a regular presence in the dining hall, often arriving quietly during less busy hours, requesting the same simple stew that had first changed his mind. He never publicly admitted defeat in any dramatic way, but those who knew him well noticed the shift immediately. His comments about human culture, once sharp and dismissive, had grown noticeably softer, occasionally even respectful. Life aboard Corin Hub did not transform overnight into something perfect. Old habits, old opinions, and old tensions between species did not disappear simply because of a few good meals. Yet something had clearly shifted beneath the surface, a quiet reminder that even the smallest, most overlooked traditions could hold value far beyond what anyone expected. Months later, during another formal Alliance dinner, the long curved table looked very different from the one Daniel remembered from that first tense night. Instead of quiet cups of plain paste, the table now held simple, warm dishes prepared by a growing team of cooks from multiple species, each contributing small touches from their own cultures alongside human techniques Daniel had taught them. As the meal began, Doran, seated near the head of the table as always, glanced toward Daniel with the faintest hint of a smile, an expression far removed from the cold mockery of their first meeting. "I suppose," Doran said quietly, mostly to himself, "there is still room for seconds." Daniel, standing nearby with a serving tray in hand, simply nodded and refilled his bowl without a word, the quiet satisfaction on his face saying everything that needed to be said. What had started as a dare meant to embarrass a single human officer had, in the end, brought an entire station closer together, proving that sometimes the smallest, most human traditions carried a kind of value that no amount of efficiency could ever replace.